we have 6 wonderful chapter contributors to start with. We're going to begin with Beth. Beth, just introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, I'm Beth Beeson-Admire. I am a teaching professor of biosciences at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
And her chapter contributor colleague is Jamie.
I'm Jamie Katniss. I'm an assistant teaching professor, also in biosciences at Rice.
And then, yes, Heather, you're going to have to introduce your cat in just a second. But first, from chapter 8, we have Kathleen.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Barrow. I'm the director of the undergrad library here at Ohio Northern University, which is in the small town of Ada, Ohio.
Also from chapter 8, Justine.
Hi, I'm Justine Post. At the time of this chapter's composition, I was the Writing Center Director and Associate Director of Rhetoric and Composition at Ohio Northern University with Kathleen.
In chapter 9, Catherine or Kathy?
Or Kathy, either one is fine. I'm Kathy Niels, use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Reference and Assessment Librarian at the University of the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C.
And then from chapter 12, Heather.
Hello, I'm Heather Hager. This is Jack, my research assistant, and I'm the research director for the STEM Learning Center at the University of Arizona and also faculty in the College of Education.
Brilliant. Okay, we're going to do some chapter overviews now. So chapter 4, which is called Navigating a Pathway to Success in Undergraduate Research. If one of you can kind of break down that chapter for us.
Sure. So in biosciences, our undergraduate labs are standalone modules, so they're not associated with courses. So what we did in this study is we looked at 3 of our scaffolded courses that are CURs, so they're course-based undergraduate researches. So we looked at one at the introductory level, at the intermediate level, which is the first required lab, and then one of our advanced labs. And we were interested in looking at the experience of the students because for all 3 of these labs, even though they're different levels, we have a shared learning goal for students to experience that not all experiments work as planned. We do not actually use the word failure in this learning goal, because so many students associate failure with failing a class. So we don't actually say failure. We just say it didn't work the way you expected it to. But when we started analyzing their data, we found they used failure a lot. And so what we looked at for this study was over 4 semesters. And we looked at 2 primarily student things. So we used the laboratory course assessment survey that Lisa Corwin developed, the LCAS survey with her and Aaron Dolan to basically look at collaboration and iteration in these CURs. And then we use student reflections to look at each of the factors that impact student responses in a failure scenario. So we looked at mindset, goal orientation, fear of failure, attribution, and coping. And so that was the paper kind of is about those 2, looking at those 2 main pieces of data and how our students, what we found, not only had to face with it and cope with it, but they actually truly did embrace it. And then Jamie, do you have anything you want to add?
And then chapter 8, No Such Thing as a Bad Question, using rubrics to help students learn from and strengthen failed research questions.
All right, I just have to say, Beth, I'm glad to know that experience failed. I had many failed experience in high school chemistry. So anyway, so our study was actually came out of a bigger study. We were studying undergraduates' research experiences in a developmental writing course. And so throughout the course, we asked the students to pose 4 research questions to practice creating research questions. So we felt like this is not something students get to do very often. It's usually like, you got your assignment, you got to create that question and bam, you're off. So the next step, we asked the students to score their questions on 4 elements as found in their textbook, which is called An Insider's Guide to Academic Writing. And so those 4 elements were personal investment, debatability, researchability, and then feasibility, really looking at is this topic too small or too big? And we thought this practice would be helpful. Like I said, they don't often have time to practice this writing. And then also these students, because they were in a developmental writing class, were also going to have to take another required writing class. So it was practice in a sense for that class. And so we thought this writing of, quote unquote, failed questions will get them to quote unquote, good questions. And then, so we assessed their questions. We created rubrics based on debatability, researchability, and feasibility. And to create rubrics really hard. We had to revise our rubric several times because our norming indicated that they were not great at first. And we had many discrepancies in scoring, but we finally got to a good place. That was a learning experience for us with rubrics. And then a study showed that this practice helps students, right? They got better at what they were doing. We did find, interestingly enough, that sometimes as 2 elements increase, like got better, 1 element did worse. So like they might have a really great question that was great in debatability and researchability, but then feasibility was no good. So this research led us to begin to think like, how can we help our students better when they're creating research questions? And so we propose in this chapter actually using these rubrics in the classroom. We don't talk about it in that chapter because we hadn't done it by then, but Justine, after we completed our chapter, was able to use these rubrics in her classes. And maybe she'll get time either now or later to talk more about that.
Yeah, Justine, tell us more about it now.
Sure, I can chime in really quickly. And one of the things I think I just want to call out with the challenge in creating the rubrics, I'm a writing instructor or was a writing instructor. Making rubrics is hard, but really the big insight for me as a writing instructor was that these concepts of like debatability, which we kind of take for granted, even researchability, feasibility, they are not at all concrete. Like it was super subjective. We had professionally trained librarians, like tenure track faculty member who also runs a writing center. We had writing center tutors. We could not agree to save our lives. So that's what actually resulted in the creation of those rubrics and why I then did use them in my classes with great success. Like the students loved it. I paired the rubrics with activities to kind of help them apply them. I think if I just handed them a rubric, it would have failed. It had to be sort of integrated into the learning experience, but it just made something that was kind of abstract and hard to wrap your head around super concrete and like facilitated conversations we had never had before. So I think that was a huge takeaway and something that I really appreciated from the study that we did.
And then chapter 9, resilience in research, confronting failure in information literacy instruction.
Sure, so that one's mine. I'm an academic librarian. So one of my many hats is teaching information literacy instruction, right? Often one-time workshops, quite often in our general education classes, a lot for freshmen, second-year students. A lot of students are basically new to research, right? We also have a highly non-traditional student population. So we have some students who are just out of high school, and we have some students who are in their 60s, right? And everything in between. So lots of experience with research coming in, different experiences with research coming into the classroom. So I adopted a resiliency approach to teaching information literacy. I was asked to include content about that in a session a couple of years ago. And the more I kind of thought through it, I was like, this is the way that I want to approach this for a few reasons. I think, and I think a lot of us think of research as an iterative and exploratory process, right? Because we're used to it. We do this all the time, right? But I found that students often think about that, especially those who are new to research, don't experience it that way. They think about it and experience it more as a failure when they encounter those challenges or inevitable roadblocks. So a couple reasons that I think this works well. One is that there's a lot of research in library and information sciences about the role of affect in information seeking. Research can be very emotional, and there's a lot of feelings involved. Students often expect a very linear process and get anxious if it's not, which it rarely, if ever, is, especially for new students. And that's not really helpful for the cognitive side of learning either. So thinking about the attitudes and values and mental frames needed for successful research is something that I try to cover. There's also the limitation of formats. We mostly do those one-time workshops. And pro tip, if you're not a librarian and you work with librarians, embed them more in the classes. We can do a lot more that way. So, if we're doing one-time things, what can you really accomplish in that time, right? You can't necessarily achieve these higher level cognitive outcomes, but what we can do is get people kind of emotionally and mentally ready, right? We can say, here are the things you'll need to know. Here are the ways you should think about it. And then come to us when you need help once you've done that. And then lastly is the Association for College and Research Libraries, the division of the American Library Association for academic librarians, has a document called the Framework for Information Literacy in Higher Education. And it's this very theoretical document about core concepts and values of information, meta-literacy, metacognition. And I think a lot of librarians struggle with it because it is so theoretical. But I think thinking about it as this sort of like affective, emotional, values-oriented framework is really helpful, right? Because there's concepts like research is inquiry in it, searching is strategic exploration that sort of highlight those exploratory, iterative aspects of research. And so it lets me draw on the framework more than I think I could before. So I think I will just end there.
And then our final chapter for today was chapter 12. You're invited to the rejection party and other strategies for normalizing rejection and failure as part of the research process.
Thank you. And our chapter was grounded in our work with students through the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Center, which has the McNair Scholars Program and other undergraduate research programs for students. So we go over strategies that we used with students to deal with rejection and failure in the research process, and then the assessment that goes along with that. So we focused on, like Kathy was just saying, normalizing the idea that research is not a linear process, that failure is just going to happen and it's how you respond to it. So our first set of strategies revolve around how we support faculty mentors in making their failures more visible to students and the process that they took after the failure. Then we focused on how we help students kind of recognize and process their own failures or rejections, particularly when they're applying to research experiences or fellowships or graduate school programs. And that's the rejection party is one of those. We throw a party each year when the RU rejections are coming out and acceptances and graduate school acceptances and rejections, and have students and faculty bring physical printouts of the rejection letters, and then we make them into art or into origami and have a beautiful collection so that students are processing and talking with each other and with faculty about that experience. And we also then have a big bowl of beautiful piles of rejections from the people students see as successful. So from their more experienced peers, from their faculty mentors, so that when they're struggling later, we can remind them that their faculty has also contributed to this rejection collection. And then the third kind of set of interventions is focused on how students actually utilize those rejections or failures. And we use kind of a reflective writing process and peer mentoring process to help them think about their experiences and how they move forward and learn from those.
Well, I know I have plenty of questions, but audience, the floor is yours. Any questions or thoughts that you want to share, any scenarios you would like this panel to weigh in on? You can simply unmute yourself and ask, or once again, you can use the chat feature, and I'm monitoring the chat, and you can place your question there if you prefer. While they're getting questions ready, I'm sure, let me ask this really easy question. Was this a first-time writing or published writing experience for any of our authors?
It's my first pedagogical research paper.
Nice.
So I've got wet lab research papers, right? But this is my first pedagogical research paper, which is really cool.
So in the chat room, we already have one thought going on here. I'm going to guess this is for Heather. The idea, they love the idea of the rejection party. My university has never done this before. Do you have any recommendations for getting something like that going?
We, it was fairly informal. We often did it at the campus coffee shop. Sometimes it coincided with Pie Day, and we would have pies while we, like on March 14th, and eat pies and celebrate rejections. The only real rule we had was that you had to have a rejection. Like, you can't come and just listen to other people's rejections. You have to put your, and with the idea that everybody has something that failed or they were rejected on. So everybody's included, but you can't come and just be a spectator. You need to participate, which was hard for often faculty were nervous to bring their, for faculty, it was often rejection letters from grants or papers or things. Or even just sometimes harsh feedback on a paper that they would bring, but sometimes faculty were a little more reluctant to bring their own vulnerability to the party. And then we brought some basic like craft supplies, like we would bring like glue sticks and scissors. A few of us happened to know like how to make a paper flower or like a paper, like a couple origami things that we could show people if they didn't know what to do with them. And then it would kind of go from there. People would start showing each other, they start, somebody makes paper airplanes, then other people do too, or things from there. So yeah, there's not a whole lot of kind of pre-work to put into it. It's really just kind of creating that space and then letting the discussion kind of naturally happens because people are physically processing this artifact of their failure. And so it's a nice time to just have discussion.
Yeah, and there are, I should say, on page 154 and 155 of the ebook, there are pictures of some of the artwork and the process there. But like you were saying, it looks like it's more about providing a space than anything. Like you don't have to budget pizza party and all sorts of mentors present and stuff like that. I really like that. Just keeping it limited to just those that are sharing rejection stories. Yeah.
And we did have sometimes students would ask us to print for them. Sometimes they don't have a printer. So like we would sometimes pre-print rejections for people.
I think it's a brilliant idea. Thanks for sharing it. I enjoyed that chapter enormously.
Thank you.
The other piece of the recognizing was also application celebrations. And so you were talking about getting students to celebrate even the fact that they've applied to scholarship or to a presentation, like whether or not they get accepted or not, like just that applying thing is such a good thing for them to do. And so celebrating just that.
Yeah. And the majority of students in our programs are first generation college students. And so we found that often the barrier was putting themselves out there because they were so afraid of the rejection. They were self-rejecting before they could even apply. And so we started, instead of celebrating students who got the fellowships and awards when they got into grad school, we also really wanted to celebrate just putting yourself out there, and that's a step. And like I think both Justine and Kathy were talking about that students see this like linear process in research, but we found that they saw a linear process in faculty career paths too, and they thought their faculty had just been perfectly successful their whole lives. And so showing them that faculty put themselves out there a lot and get rejected a lot, and celebrating that. And we would also celebrate rejections, like in the weekly class we had with the McNair scholars. If somebody got a rejection, we would all clap and like cheer for them, because you have to get rejected to things to get accepted to other things. So trying to, reframe those experiences as not being about their worth, but about the process and the necessary part of the process.
Yeah, and I'm so thankful for the graph you provided on page 150. It's just a basic XY axis of opportunity and intentionality. And just talking about a lot of failures happen in that bottom left quadrant, which it's labeled sloppy mistakes, right? Someone cuts it at 2 millimeters instead of 3, and thus all the data is off, kind of a thing. Versus really pushing the students into that top right, which is the stretch mistakes. And like, it's okay to fail, especially in that stretch mistakes. You were doing things with great intentionality and great opportunity, and it may not happen the first time. So that graph was just a really simple graph of like, if you're going to fail in this quadrant, not like in this quadrant, because we all know what failure in that quadrant looks like.
Yeah, and especially as undergraduate researchers, we're asking them to really stretch beyond what they've maybe been prepared to do or have done or feel comfortable doing before. So the more we can get them to stretch intentionally and make small failures so that they're not making big catastrophic failures, the more we're going to celebrate that. Another intervention we did is we have students interview their faculty about their previous failures and their career path. And the students' minds would just be like blown that their faculty had like failed a course one time or had to redo their comprehensive exams, or, you know, just all these normal human things that happen to people who become faculty. And so that was really powerful for students to see the struggles their faculties had overcome and not just their successes.
Anyone else, feel free to jump in. I will I also wanted to talk to Kathy. So I know one of the major themes of the book was keeping the undergraduate researcher in mind when responding to failure. And your book, like you were talking about, like really talks about almost the emotional elements. In fact, page 124, my focus then has become preparing students for the emotional elements of research and possible negative feelings that may arise. And then you are quoting another scholar's work. They refer to this as the tolerance of uncertainty that leads to patience and perseverance that allows for building interest in emerging ideals. But I thought what was really interesting, Kathy, in your chapter was you talked about, so you often have these one-shot experiences. A professor invites you in to get the students prepared for whatever. But you were saying you don't like to use just generic, where was it? For instance, in modulars on developing search terms, I include a class brainstorming activity in which students choose a research topic and generate potential keywords. So instead of just going in and saying, if your topic is X, try also X plus Y plus Z plus, you actually work with the class to create their own things. And I just thought that was really helpful, that like modeling of how to think forward almost. Tell me more about that, how'd that come to be?
Yeah, and I think that's something that we often do in reference transactions and one-on-one consultations as well, right? Is we're doing this kind of on the fly a little bit, but you get to, you know, model the process as you go, as you work with a student, which I think is a really cool thing. Yeah, I just, you know, I think it can be really, you know, I mean, part of it is just, you know, scaffolding a bunch of different research skills right throughout a class, and research questions can be one of them. So I'm really interested. I have not, unfortunately, read Kathleen and Justine's chapter yet, but I'm really excited to now. But yeah, just seeing the process, right? Because I think it's one thing to just like, you know, go through, here's what it would look like, and then, you know, to actually have some kind of hands-on experience, to see how it works in practice, and also to get student voices into the classroom a little bit more. And one of the things that we struggle with is, you know, we don't get to have full semester long relationships with students unless we're teaching a 4-credit class. And so it can be kind of hard to get the student voice and perspective into the classroom. And so to have them share a topic that is of interest to them, I think can be really helpful and powerful. So yeah, that's one of the things we like to do.
Well, this was, I mean, my college experience was 25 years ago, but I remember constantly moving between this, I was the first generation in my family to go to college, and just full of this almost arrogance of like, I know, like I've arrived at 18 just knowing more than, you know, anyone else in my family. And then also like constantly coming up against scenarios where I was like, oh, like I've done this poorly kind of a thing. And I loved how you said on 126, I start here by simply saying, breathe. This is normal. Research is a process. You've got this and can get help. Yeah. Like, I think even that piece of just, there are people here to support you Just shoot, like, I don't know if I heard that message a lot when I was in college. It was, here's the project, I want you to go do it.
Yeah.
And we'll talk with the other professors as well, but like, it seems like there's a lot more emphasis on team dynamics and working together in groups,
Absolutely.
that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was mentioning before, I think we started officially, that I'm working on a research project about how faculty design their research assignments and how they teach research for writing composition classes. And one of the things we heard again and again in the in-depth interviews that we conducted was faculty themselves had never been really formally trained on how to do research. It was kind of like, go forth and do this, figure it out, you know, sink or swim. And so they're very consciously not doing that for their students, which I think is really, really good. That's again, like the kind of thing that I can kind of bite off and chew in those, you know, one-time sessions, to say that it is, you know, it's going to be a process. It is hard. At the same time, I think a complicating factor that I'm mindful of, and there's an article that I talk about, I think in the last paragraph of the chapter, about there's a study that some librarians at a community college did about the challenges to persistence and iteration and all that in research among students who are trying to balance school and caregiving and work, and, you know, low-income students who have a lot of things going on, which is the case with the students at my institution too. And so I'm trying to figure out how we balance that. Some of this is going to take a while. It is a process. You just have to dig in and do it, versus you don't necessarily have the time to do all of this because you have to go pick up your kid, or you have a full-time job and you're doing this at night, you know. So how do you balance the like exploration versus the realities, and be able to support the students in both? And that's something that I'm still wrestling with.
So there's a question in the chat geared towards Kathleen and Justine. They write, I also really enjoyed the chapter on creating a rubric for research questions. Any thoughts on using that rubric in other classes, such as the social sciences or science classes? What recommendations might you have?
Yeah, so I can start, and Kathleen, if you want to add anything, feel free to jump in. So one of the things I would point out, because we designed these rubrics for use in like a developmental, very introductory academic writing course, they are not disciplinary specific. So they are meant to kind of cross fields. That also means they're very broad. And so as you kind of move within a particular context, it gives you an opportunity to think, what do these criteria look like differently in my realm, right? And to refine them and narrow them in. So I think we would offer these rubrics as like a very we hope a very useful starting point that you absolutely should take and adapt to your context. I think the thing that makes a rubric effective is that it gives students a concrete target to shoot for. And so if the targets, as we've kind of spelled them out, don't totally align with your context, tweak with them, play with them, trial and error, test them out, like see what works. But it gives you a really great opportunity to kind of make really concrete for students so they can strive in specific ways. And I think the real key to using rubrics effectively is practice. So that's both on your end, sort of practicing so that you're consistent and applying the criteria that you spell out, but you cannot just hand a rubric to a student and expect it to help. You really have to teach them how to engage with it and how to use it, and give them that space to practice with support and feedback. So I think for this to be most effective, it's really thinking about what should these things look like in my specific context, and then how am I going to support students and helping them effectively engage with it.
I would just add, we have somewhere we put a Creative Commons license on those rubrics, so please use and reuse and adapt the way it would help you.
I just want to add, like, really quick, that I really appreciate the emphasis on developing the research question, because I think that's something that students often get really tripped up on, is they come and they'll say, I need help with this paper. And I'm like, that's great. Tell me what your research question is. And they say, I'm writing about gentrification. Like, that's great. What about it? Right. You know, like, you've got multiple books there, like you're writing a 10-page paper, or you're creating a podcast. So like having that, that process, I think, is extremely valuable to start out with. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. And that's like, we had conversations about it as we were surprised by how much trouble we actually had with like classifying the difference between a strong question and a weak question. And I don't think we use this language in the chapter, but we talked about the handbooks that we had for support as basically like just presenting a black box to students. Like you put in a bad question and it comes out good, but there wasn't actually like specific things that they could do or work on to get there. And with like the research question has such a big influence on like how you select your sources and build the case for the argument that you end up making. Like I was kind of shocked as a writing instructor. I mean, I taught writing for 13 years and it wasn't until we did this study that I was like, oh my gosh, my support for the research process is so inadequate and like research questions are so important. So it totally changed my perspective. And I'm super grateful to have had that opportunity to collaborate in that way.
So I think I know, but what's the main difference between having a student who's really curious about a topic and having a student that like knows what research question they're asking?
You said you think you know, so I'm actually gonna ask you to say a little more about what you're thinking, and I'll gladly share my perspective then.
Well, you spend some time at the beginning of the chapter talking about topics, but really, so I'm thinking about my senior project with, once again, was a paper on a historiography of Attila the Hun. And so like looking back, I had a topic, I was given a topic, and I think the only question was figure out how our understanding of this human being has flowed throughout the history of the biographical of Attila. And looking back, I'm like, that was a horrible research question. Like that might have been really researchable, and it was. I mean, you just type in Attila the Hun and you get 20 books and you just check them out, and then I don't know, you spend 6 months reading them, kind of a thing. But like I really feel like I think it's great to be curious about things, but then knowing what's like the thing behind the thing that's driving that curiosity, like that's actually could be your research question, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So I would just say, like, in terms of how, as an instructor, I could gauge a student's curiosity or interest in a topic, I really can't. I have no idea whether a student is super passionate and interested in something or they're performing. But the way that I know that they're not interested is if I assign the topic. Right? Like if I say, this is what you can research, then I know for a fact that none of my students are super curious about it. They are performing in the way that I am conditioning them to perform. If I open space and say, okay, you can research anything that you want, like, and we might talk, I always had the philosophy of like, I do not ban topics in my classes. We talk about why something would be problematic or difficult, but it's like, do whatever you want. When I create those conditions, my like sort of estimate would be maybe 25% of my students are genuinely curious and passionate about what they're researching. And 75% of them are researching a question they've researched before, or something that immediately comes to mind, or that Google tells them to research, right? Like there are lots of different motives that drive our students' research processes. And I wouldn't necessarily lift one up over another. And like, I can only speculate about why they're looking into particular things, but I can be very careful to create the space that creates the opportunity for them to pursue their curiosities. And I can talk about my own curiosities and how I pursue them. I can model that behavior. I can encourage it. But you're talking to someone who had a career teaching required courses. So, my interactions with students are probably different than the person who's like in the upper level social sciences course or something like that. But, the sort of like the kind of aspects that we can think about, I think there are clear ways that we can eliminate curiosity. It's very easy to prevent students from having it. It's more challenging. to guarantee that they're going to have it, but we can create the conditions that at least make it possible.
Kathy, you say the background research that informs the research question is also research.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think a lot of students often assume that they are just going to jump right into the research question and get started. And, when they do have that kind of general topic, but they don't know what direction you go in it with it, I said, that is when you sit down and do some Googling, right? That is where it's good to do some Googling, where you can use Wikipedia, that kind of thing. Until you see something that sparks your interest, right? And that's part of the process too. Yeah, I think that's something I also do try to emphasize, is that getting to that, what you are going to focus on, is a little bit of work as well.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add that personal investment was one of the criteria in the handbook that we started with for evaluating the effectiveness of the question. And I taught it and I encouraged it. And ultimately, we didn't measure it because as researchers on the outside, we didn't have a reliable way to actually be able to say this student is invested in this question or not. So I think it is a super important research concept, but it's also something I think you have to be careful about trying to evaluate as an outside perspective.
Yeah, the criteria, at least listed on page 108, was personal investment, debatable subject, researchable issue, feasibility, and contribution. And you said that was a process getting just even to those 5 criteria?
No, those 5 criteria came from the handbook that I used with my students. And so when I taught this for the first time, those were the criteria we used with them. But then when we approached the data from the research perspective, we dropped the focus on personal investment because we didn't feel like we could evaluate it. And then, oh, what was the 5th one you said? It slipped my mind.
Is sorry, I just went off the page. It's something about contribution, right? Yeah, contribution.
Oh yeah, contribution. Sorry, thank you. So we took that off the table. I actually did not teach my students, because I was in a developmental writing course. I did not teach them to strive to make a contribution to an academic conversation, because I felt very strongly that just sets the bar way too high. Like when we are looking at like senior level students or graduate students, we can start to have conversations about contributing to the academic conversation, but at that like very developmental first year kind of level, they're just trying to figure out what an academic conversation is. And I was just really excited for them to, like, if they could wrap their head around the conversation, that was fantastic. If they could accurately represent the conversation, that was fantastic. And so we eliminated that 5th criteria as well. We did not focus on contribution in their research.
I'm going to use that as a segue, I think, to Beth and Jamie, because one of the things I was struck in your chapter is that there seemed to be almost like a generative flow between introductory, beginner, middle, intermediate, and advanced. Like it felt like your researchers didn't have to get A to Z. They could get A to F, and they knew someone would pick up at F and get it further down the road. So talk to me a little bit, like, was that just a model you guys discovered, or something that just happens at Rice, or is that just something you guys discovered upon?
I'll jump in. I part of it, I think, is just the reality of a semester's time in some respects, right? So, when we start with the introductory, the students are coming in, they have no research experience whatsoever, right? So we're just happy they can pick up the pipetter and figure out how it works. And so we're not ready yet to go after, that home run experiment yet, right? We're gonna build those basic skills. So I think in some respects, maybe we discovered it by accident, I guess, in some respects, because as Beth talked about it, like, our classes aren't tied to a lecture, but they're also not tied to each other either. And it's like, one may be a prerequisite, like mine's a prerequisite to her advanced classes, and they learn skills, that they're going to apply later, but their skills are not the research question, if you will. And so I don't know. It just kind of, I think we're sort of confined by what our learning objectives are for the semester, and the time that they're going to spend in the lab with us, because they've got other classes, right? and just thinking about like what's achievable within reason, right? And they can get there, or they may not, or they can go even further, right? I mean, we have some that go even just further just because they, things worked out that way. What are your thoughts, Beth?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, it was kind of interesting because it used to be, they're independent courses, and like students don't necessarily have to, other than the intermediate lab, that's the only required one. And so when we first started doing when we transformed everything and we were trying to find, bring projects in, right? It just like Jamie and I were talking one day and he's like, oh, well, my students are working on this. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe we could bring that. And, they're working on getting a clone to basically express a recombinant protein. And then, but my advanced lab is all about the students purifying and characterizing proteins. And so it's like, well, what if your students can get it to express? Then my students can pick it up in the advanced lab and actually do the purification. And then, so initially when we started that, it was mainly focusing on kind of intermediate to advanced. And then COVID happened and his students didn't get so far on their project. They designed primers for Gibson assembly, but never really got to proceed with that experiment. And I needed an experiment for my first year students. I did not want to try to have them do primer design, but I was like, all right, Gibson assembly, we can talk about that. They just have to mix some stuff together in a tube and stick it in the PCR machine. And so his project came into the first year lab. And then now that project is going back into the intermediate. So the students love the fact that they'll come into my advanced lab and they're like, but we let them kind of pick certain projects. Like we say, oh, we have a project in the advanced lab. I'm like, okay, we're going to be purifying. We have these different clones, your team gets to pick which one you want to work with. And they're like, oh, I worked on this in 211. I got to like actually build the clone that actually makes this protein. And so they get all excited because, they're actually able to pick something up, or they're able to contribute something for like a future lab course. So they aren't worried. They don't seem to be so worried as much about how far they get, because they realize like, oh, we're doing stuff that's novel, that, we don't know what's happening. And so any progress they make is progress that's going to actually feed into a subsequent semester. And so I think that I know one of y'all mentioned that initially, like, having them connect with it, it has to be meaningful. It has to be real. It's not just something we tell them to do. We do have a select number of projects, but we don't tell the students exactly what to do. Even in the introductory lab, we give them some choice. It's a little more guided, but we give them choice. And, letting them have that choice and being able to kind of decide which path they want to take, I think is really important.
So you guys also talk about the role of collaboration. And I will say we talked to the authors in chapter 16 last week, and they've taken collaboration into the mentoring. They do co-mentoring. So they are trying to model it for the students, but they have their students at Elan in teams as well. So talk to me about the connection between being a part of a team or being able to have other people in this same situation when it comes to like responding to failure.
I think the fact that they are working as a team helps them cope with it better, because then when something doesn't work, it's more like, oh, let's work together and figure out how we can move past this, or what went wrong, or what we need to do differently. Whereas if they're working individually and it doesn't work, they tend to blame themselves, right? It's like, oh, I messed up. I did something wrong. And, and sometimes even working as a team, they'll know, they're like, oh, I like, added too much of this stuff. And right. And then the team's like, oh, that's okay. Next time when we do it, we'll make sure that we do it right. So I think by having them work as a team and collaborate, I think it kind of, it makes them assign the blame, not to themselves individually, but to recognize like, oh, this is just science. And sometimes science works and sometimes it doesn't. And we do teams differently. In my courses, I actually assign teams because I want to make sure that the teams are diverse and that they're coming in with different levels of experience and different backgrounds. Jamie lets his students kind of form their own teams. They pick their own teams. And, you know, there's pluses and minuses for each format, but going through our program, the students actually get to experience kind of both. And so sometimes they work with a team. It's a team that they, you know, self-selected. And then they're also working with teams that, you know, like in the real world, right? They're going to be working with other people that they didn't necessarily know before they started working there, or they didn't, you know, they wouldn't have necessarily picked them. So I think that the team stuff has really helps them deal with helps them actually cope much better with the failure. And then they get really excited because they want to try to figure out what went wrong or what they can do differently. Jamie, please add anything. If you
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we also, I know we say it in the chapter also, is that the grade is not tied at all to the success of the experiments, because they're the ones that are making the daily decisions. And so their decision may not pan out, right? That's not going to work. But they're able to explore that because that's what was interesting to them, or that's the way they thought it should go. And like I said, as a team, they you know, I agree. I think as an individual, they're going to blame themselves. They're going to be like, oh, I chose the wrong thing. But as a team, they had to agree, like, yeah, that's the direction we're going to go. You know, with guidance, right? I'm there to, I often joke, like, I'm a tour guide. You know, I'm pointing out the highlights and the pitfalls, you know, but it's their adventure. They get to, you know, they get to go off and do things.
So one of the things that has made this book a delight to read is there's this great diversity of institutional type settings, diversity of the disciplines represented, of undergraduate research experiences, whether it's CURs or REUs, some are REUs, or all sorts of experiences are covered. I'm struck on page 52, you guys write, rather than attempting to get the right answer, as in traditional teaching laboratory settings, the students have the opportunity to pursue the answer. The structure allows them to orient their goals towards the mastery of the experiential techniques rather than the outcome. And that seems like a shift from maybe what my experience was in college. So tell me a little bit, how did you arrive kind of at that, what seems to me to be a fresh mindset? Like, if you take away some of that pressure to get a right answer or an answer that they know you already know, some of that failure, that pressure of failure, I would think just kind of evaporates into the air.
Yeah, I mean, we actually, that statement, we actually formed directly from, I would say, student feedback. I mean, I know I used the protein lab that is now, they kind of pick their own protein that they explore how to purify. It used to be, you know, we had a protein that we had a native form, a recombinant form. We had a project that mimicked like what they would do in a research lab, but I knew what the answers were supposed to be. They knew what the answers were supposed to be. They were working in teams, but when they failed, then they still would get very frustrated. And it was like, you know, it was very disappointing. And the first semester that we started doing an open-ended project, we were there, like, I accidentally ordered the wrong material. And so it was taking us a really long time to do this step in a purification. And so I'm down there with them, and we did it, and like nothing happened. No one got any protein. And I asked them, I said, so are y'all don't seem like upset that y'all are here? I mean, this is like way past when we were supposed to be doing this work. And they were like, yeah. I said, nothing has worked so far. And they're like, yeah, but that's okay, because you don't know what it's supposed to be either. You didn't know what it was supposed to do. And that's just the way science is. And so by just that simple shift, by letting them have a voice and kind of picking what they were asking, and then letting them go off and explore, even when it doesn't turn out the way they want it to, I think they have a better appreciation that that's just sometimes the way it is. And it's such a different mindset from when we know what the answer is. When we know what the answer is and they don't get that answer, then that means that they messed up, because what's the other explanation. If there's supposed to be an answer and they didn't get it, they must have messed up.
Yeah, I just added to that. We always tell them we emphasize the process and not the outcome. And I always tell them is like, there's, look, there's going to be fantastic new questions in 10 years. I haven't a clue what to tell you how to prepare for them other than let's figure out the process, because you'll know what to do, because I don't know the outcome.
And then Justine and Kathleen, is that a similar mindset when you guys write on 106? There's no such thing as a bad research question, as students must write their way through failed questions to develop research questions worthy of scholarly inquiry. For students to learn from the struggle to pose effective research questions, their failures must be recognized and supported.
There's failures all the time in research, and I try to tell students, and I'm sure Kathy knows this, I always tell students, I never find what I want on that first search. Like, I may think I have the perfect research question, and then I go to look for something and there's like nothing on this question, right? So it's just part of the process. And I always tell them, like, I have a master's degree in library science and I've been a librarian forever. Like, it's just part of the process. So I don't know, sometimes just modeling also that I don't know, it's not messing up, it's just part of the process, right?
One of the most fun activities that I've done in a class is is like a warm-up activity about drawing your research process, right? And I showed mine. I had like a big squiggle, and just like up and downs and all of that. And so I put up, butcher paper and students drew, and it was like kind of all over the place. Like I think I mentioned in the chapter, there was one that was just like a stick figure swearing, and like others had like circles, and others were like, yay, research. And kind of just to get that out there, to see that everybody kind of goes through some kind of mental process or like emotional struggle or journey of some kind, I think was really fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say, like, I think that's like a really strong through line in this panel, and probably the whole book, is this focus on process. And I think what you're hearing from all of us is like, that's where the learning happens, right? Like when we take focus off of that end goal and performance and shift to like, how do we get there? Like, what are the processes that we go through? Like, that's where learning happens. And I've just been sitting back like in awe, listening to all of you, and like, can we just start a failure academy, please? And like combine all of these beautiful learning experiences that are happening in all these different places, and like, what would happen? It's amazing. So thank you all for your sharing your thoughts, because it's been awesome.
No, Kathy, you write on 123, students often experience iteration and exploration, which is a perfectly normal and even useful aspect of the research process as a form of failure, and that I needed to address those feelings of failure head on, which I thought, like we were saying, it's a process, but there's something about the process that often feels troubling to us, even when it's not troubling, it's normal. And so just, yeah, the openness that we can all share about our failure, a lot of the resource processes or strategies that Heather mentions in chapter 12, like, I think that's just super healthy to normalize the process that is undergraduate research. Well, we're nearing our time. If anyone else has any thoughts or questions, you can unmute yourself now or throw it in the chat and I'll read it out for everyone. Otherwise, it looks like there's several thank yous in the chat. Once again, panel, it's been wonderful talking with you. And a recording of this will be emailed out to everyone in attendance today so that you can share and rewatch. If you do have any further questions or insights, you can reach out to us at CUR@CUR.org, and we'll make sure it gets posed to the right people. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you again in November for our last one, which is mentoring through failure. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye.